focus of the first ever joint meeting of G20 Labour and Finance Ministers was the possibility of elaborating coordinated policy by finance and labour employment ministries in the G20 countries to promote strong, sustainable and balanced growth and a supportive environment for job creation. Mzoxolo Mpolase, the head of analysis at Political Analysis South Africa, joins us now to evaluate whether the G20 can deliver on that very task. Now, Mzoxolo, for the first time, we saw the coming together of labour ministers together with finance ministers. What should we understand from this coordinated approach to tackle employment creation?
Well, it's a realization that whether be it developed economies and developing economies, that unemployment is on the rise, particularly in European markets. So it is a response to that, and also for the first time trying to come up with a coordinated policy of how to come about that. But at the same time, it is a concession that the way things have been done, it's not sustainable. Mm-hmm. It needs a more coordinated approach. You cannot have labour ministries coming up with policies which are not in sync with how the world economy functions. So it's to streamline how the labour market is perceived beyond just the International Labour Organization, to actually have tangible on-the-ground measures for labour creation.
But going into the meeting, Mzoxolo, we had a lot of emerging markets obviously concerned about the spillover effects of quantitative easing, and everybody sort of waiting for Bernanke's statement. Should the absence of a statement on joint coordination, since we're saying that coordination is the new way to go, should the absence of a joint statement be understood to be a failure of this meeting?
Well, in some ways, all these multilateral organizations have become a talk shop in some way. Though you may have commitments, those commitments never really have any tangible association with them. So that is a problem. And also, though you say there will be coordination of policy with regards to labour, how will it be achieved? How will South Africa synchronize its labour policies with Germany, for instance? So it is also the conceding that it cannot work, but at the same time, they will make those commitments to see where it goes.
So if it is a talk shop, let's look at the impact for Africa. I mean, we know that South Africa has a very clear Africa agenda as it goes into every G20 gathering. Did South Africa manage to clinch anything for its Africa agenda out of this particular meeting?
Sadly, no. Generally, the typical relationship that you have with Africa and all of these intergovernmental organizations is always developmental commitment, it's always aid commitment. So right now you can't have economies with which are shrinking and don't have that much by way of reserves to now be committing to Africa. So the typical relationship is that of aid, is that of developmental assistance. So in an environment where these economies are worrying about their own unemployment, it's overreaching to expect tangible commitments for Africa.
Are you conceding then that there's a misalignment between the realities of African governments and their markets with the outcomes and the discussions and deliberations that go on at the G20?
There is, as I say, there's this traditional relationship. There is, you know, when they were discussing the G20, when they are talking about, you know, better tax coordination and all of that, the platforms that they mentioned were all the typical Euro-American platforms. They're going to realize it via the Bretton Woods Institution, WTO, World Bank and so forth. No real south-looking policy when it comes to that. So without any real change to international financial institutions, Africa will always be sidelined. So it's not a question whether Africa is you know, brought into the fray. It's a question of this is how the international financial system works, and it will always be decided in that way.
Coming out of this meeting, of course, we had a reinforced commitment to the ongoing discussion around revisiting the structure of the international economic system and the financing system, and saying that you know, the G20 will continuously support the reform of that particular system. Would a reform system see a greater voice for south-looking policies?
They would, and Russia had actually made it one of its priorities when it came to them taking over the G20 presidency, that they will seek for a structural shift and also restructuring of the whole international financial institutions. But then that needs financial commitment. So though they've been talking it in BRICS, they've been talking it in South-South platforms, without any real financial commitment, there will be no change in the, in the system that operates currently. So Russia, Brazil, China, and all of the major developing economies will need to actually have financial commitments to whatever changes they want to see in the international financial order.
One of the key items that seemed to have struck a chord with international media coming out of this meeting was the discussion around tax reforms, and especially around how to curb tax evasions by multinational companies. Now, if we look at the African context, is this also something that that has relevance for Africa?
Well, it does have relevance. It's always good to have, I would say, world-class tax system. But then again, I think it was a concession of that whatever was agreed in this G20 will not work, because if you're looking to reform tax, that means that there's been tax evasion. So your commitment is punitive rather than forward-looking in terms of how you're going to create this employment that you're talking about. The whole communique is littered about how there will be employment forthcoming and all of that. But then you have a punitive, backward-looking measure. Of course, indeed, it is good to have a good taxing system. You know that the whole world is grasping this idea of, you have bigger countries like Russia putting their money in Cyprus, evading taxes in Russia, and similarly you have Indians putting money in Mauritius and evading tax there. So it would help in some way, but in the end of the day, that communique has a message, has a gist of we want to create employment, but then the biggest achievement, the biggest sort of consensus came around just tax policy. Yeah. So it falls short of what the expectations were.
Is it realistic, though, to expect, whether it's African or any other geography, that national tax regulation laws could possibly keep up with a globalized multinational, especially in light of the pace at which companies are growing and expanding to other geographies, and stateless money, if I may call it that? Is it realistic that there could actually be a national regulatory framework that is strong enough to form any sort of regulation?
Well, that is possible. There could be some semblance of it, not in its entirety, of course. I always come back when there's always critics of whether there'll be international cooperation around such a vital issue. There has been cooperation elsewhere. The UN is cooperation day in, day out. How we perceive air travel is cooperation day in, day out. And there's a framework by which all countries adhere to. So maybe bringing about a sort of unified tax system the problem will not be whether it's possible. It will be about, will those countries agree? It will come down to the sort of bilateral, multilateral relations rather than can such a regulatory framework exist.
Before I let you go, of course, the central theme of this particular meeting was around the shared challenge of employment creation and job creation. Reflecting back, do you think this was a successful meeting?
When it comes to the commitment of tax, yes, and I'm sure central banks are happy about that. But in terms of the citizenry of all of these countries, unemployment with what came out of the G20 will not be dented at all. It will actually continue to rise.